we all understand how important saying the words, as we say, if one just reads the Shema, you can have all the intent in the world. Intent without articulation has no value. It has value in terms of maybe a dedication, but in terms of one's fulfillment of the mitzvah, if the mitzvah can only be executed through verbalization, one doesn't verbalize it, one does not fulfill the mitzvah. So since the Shema has to be said, so if one does not say the Shema, regardless of what you think in your heart, it has no value regarding the fulfillment of this commandment, then one must accept the dominion of God twice a day. You must say these words. What about if you say the words, but you have no intent? You have no intent. If you have a minimal level of focus, one fulfills the mitzvah. However, qualitatively speaking, it's considered not the most advanced level of fulfillment, but one fulfills his obligation on a minimal level, as long as he understands what the words mean, or conceptually what he's saying, that those words mean he's accepting the dominion of God upon himself. But the ultimate is to have both, a combination of both. Say the words correctly, verbalize them, articulate them correctly, and they should be infused with the proper intent. And if you have both, then you've actually achieved a qualitative fulfillment of this mitzvah or any mitzvah. However, by Shema, as I said, the Shulchan Aruch rules that although when we normally say a blessing and we say the name of Hashem, even if we don't think more than the basic understanding, Yud-Kei Vav-Kei means master, because that's the pronunciation. However, it all connotes much more than master. Since we said it's spelled Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, not as master, Aleph Daled Nun Yud, therefore, it also alludes that God is infinite. He was, is, and is in the future. However, when you say a bracha, or any other time you say the name of Hashem, one doesn't have to think that understanding of God's being, that he's infinite, thinking master is sufficient. Of course, if you have that additional intent, it elevates it to another level. But in the Shema, because it's fundamental in terms of accepting his dominion upon you, the Shulchan Aruch rules that when you say Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, you should not only think master, you should also think that he is infinite. He was, is, and in the future. When you say Elokeinu, you think Almighty. You should think that. But Elokeinu, even if you don't, you should think he is the Almighty. It's important to think that. Normally, when you say Elokeinu, one doesn't have to think that. Elokeinu, he's our God. But in the Shema, because you're articulating his totality regarding how he relates to his existence, he's Almighty. And then again, he's Echad, the unity of God. So it's not sufficient you should just say the words. They also have to be infused with this additional intent, which is integral to the fulfillment of this particular mitzvah. Okay? But we had mentioned that in addition, that when you say certain words, as you say it explicitly, you shall love God with all your life, meaning that you're agreeable to give your life to God, and you mean it. However, if you have an additional infusion of intent, that if the situation should present itself, where you're confronted with giving your life, and in your mind and your emotion, you will give your life, whether it's to be drowned or be burnt or be shot, or whatever way that death will be brought upon the person, Hashem values it as if you actually experience death in that particular context, whether it's decapitation, whether it's burning, whether it's execution, whatever, some other way, it doesn't make a difference. You're fully accredited as if you died to sanctify God's name, which is the ultimate level of mitzvah. So we had mentioned this. And there's certain times you should have this in mind. So over here, I had mentioned it originally. The origin is a Zohar, which is cited by the Sod V'Shosh Avoda, who's wrote a work, a commentary on the weekday prayer service, Shabbos prayer service, and the Yom Tov prayer service, and the high holidays and the festivals, all based on the Zohar. And he cites the Zohar regarding this, what we're speaking here right now, that if you have in mind at certain points when you say the name of Hashem, words, for instance, before we say we begin the Amidah, we say, Ein Elokim zu l'osecho. There's nobody outside of you, God. You're the only God there is. Saying those words is sufficient if you focus on what the words mean. Ein Elokim zu l'osecho. There's no God but you. But in addition, how do you demonstrate that you mean that to the ultimate? There's no God outside of you. Therefore, if I'm confronted with a situation where I have to forfeit my life on behalf of you, I'm willing to give up my life. That's what one thinks when you say Ein Elokim zu l'osecho. That's based on the Zohar. However, there is a Rosh, Rabbeinu Osher, who was from the earlier commentators. Rabbeinu Osher was the leading Ashkenazic Torah sage. At the time of the early commentaries, he was a contemporary of Rambam. Maimonides was in Spain, Egypt, and the Rosh was originally in Germany. And he fled from Germany. He went to Italy, or in those days, he went to Spain. He went to Toledo, as we say, not Toledo, Ohio, Toledo, Spain. Why did he flee from Germany? It was the Bavarian states, because there was a story, his Rebbe, the Rebbe of the Rosh, teacher, the mentor of the Rosh, who was the leading Torah sage of that era, his name was Rabbeinu Meir of Rutenberg. Rutenberg. Who was Rabbi Meir Rutenberg? He was the leading Torah sage of all Ashkenazic Jewry. Ashkenazic Jewry meant Germany, England, and France. That's where the Ashkenazic early commentators were. He was after Rashi. And the king of that particular state, because they had all these vassal states, had taken the Maram Rutenberg captive and put him in a tower. And he said he would only release him from this tower if the Jewish communities of Germany pay the ransom note. The ransom note was enormous amount of money. It would have actually depleted the Jewish communities of their financial worth. That's what he wanted. And Maram Rutenberg gave the order that although there's normally an obligation to ransom a Jew, it's a question of saving his life, he forbade it, and he says nobody should give not a mark or a thaler, whatever the currency was in those days, that he should be ransomed. And he was in the tower for 15 years, and he died in the tower because if they followed the order, as much as they wanted to raise money to redeem him from a state of captivity, he died. He died in captivity. And afterwards, the king, talking about bad people, he said, I will not release his body unless you ransom the body. Now it's a question, he's lying in disgrace. He'll decompose. Factually, he didn't decompose. He was a very holy man. There was miraculously somehow the body was released, but he understood, the Rabbeinu Osher, being the primary student of the Maram Rutenberg, understood that he's the next candidate to be taken captive. And the king's not going to let up, and eventually he's going to put the Jews in a position, he's going to force every last dollar out of them and deplete the community financially and literally impoverish them. So what did the Rosh do, Rabbeinu Osher? He and his son, Rabbeinu Yaakov, who I mentioned, he authored the first Shulchan Aruch. No, he was known as the Tur. Always quote the Baal HaTurim, that was his son. They fled under the cover of darkness. They fled Germany, and they went to Toledo, Spain. But you realize he's an Ashkenazic sage. Toledo, Spain, there was Sephardim. The Sephardic, they had different approaches, different perspectives of many things, although they were great Torah sages. So he went to Toledo, Spain, and the leading Torah sage in that community, Toledo, his name was Rabbeinu Shlomo ben Aderes. Rabbeinu Shlomo ben Aderes was the Rashba. It's known as the Rashba. That's the acronym, Rashba. Rabbeinu Shlomo ben Aderes. And Sephardic Jews studied certain secular subjects which Ashkenazi Jews did not. The Ashkenazic perspective was based on Rabbeinu Meir Oragola, who was the Rebbe of Rashi, that Jews, for livelihood, they did not engage in the sciences or in philosophy. They engaged, like Rashi was a wine merchant, he had vineyards. They did not engage in anything outside of Torah study. If they had to earn a living, they had certain sources of livelihood, whether you were a wine producer or merchants, goldsmiths, silversmiths, whatever it was, but not engaging, using the intellect for anything for Torah they did not. Sephardic Jews were different. That physicians, that astronomers, that because they pursued, and they had philosophers. They studied philosophy. Rabbeinu Osher comes to Toledo, Spain, and the Sephardic community seek out his advice on these certain areas. And he felt that they should not study philosophy. The science is fine, medicine, astronomy is fine, but philosophy not. Why? Because what philosophy did to the Jewish community, we're talking about now the community is about 1,300. And actually, when you study philosophy, it can actually create certain doubts or certain other alternatives to certain beliefs which are fundamentals of Judaism, or to question them, especially if a young person studies them. A person who's well-weathered in Torah perspective, there's nothing to worry about. You understand what's on the other side of the fence, you refute it, and it only strengthens your belief. But a young person who hasn't fully internalized the concepts, or hasn't learned all of them, engaging in philosophy too early would actually could bring to a state of heresy. And it was happening. And there was a very serious argument between Rabbeinu Osher and Rabbi Shlomo ben Aderes. Rabbeinu Osher said they have to stop it. They should not study philosophy whatsoever. It wasn't a question of the medicine or the other sciences. But philosophy, they have to stop it. Not to study whatsoever. The Rashba said, but that's our approach. Unfortunately, there are casualties, but it's important they should study philosophy. And it was a very serious argument on this. There was a compromise. The compromise was between Rabbeinu Osher and Reb Shlomo ben Aderes that no one is permitted to study philosophy until he's 26 years old. 26 years old, he's married, he's mature, he's out of experience, he studied sufficiently, and he's open to direction. Therefore, that was the compromise. At the age of 26, they could study philosophy. Although the Rabbeinu Osher was opposed to it, he felt that because of the detriment and the damage it could cause, they shouldn't. But that was the compromise in the community between the Sephardic approach and the Ashkenazic approach. I'm only giving you the background on who Rabbeinu Osher was. So Rabbeinu Osher wrote a work, Orches Chaim, about how a Jew has to conduct his life on many levels as a Jew. So he writes that one says the Shema over there, and you say the words, certain words in the Shema, you have to think about if you're confronted with a situation where you must give your life, and you, in your mind, you visualize and depict it, you will give it. He writes, doesn't cite the Zohar, God values it as if you gave your life. Similar to what the Zohar says. Probably the source is the Zohar. I mentioned this concept from the Ramchal. Rabbeinu Moshe Chaim Luzzatto writes the same thing. It's as if you've given your life. And they quote the same verse. The David HaMelech says, Olecha horagnu kol hayom. For you, we are murdered every day. So the simple understanding of that verse is that Jews throughout history, due to anti-Semitism, have always been murdered. That's the simple understanding. But according to the Zohar and what they explain, no, every Jew every day is able to die multiple times. That if you visualize in your mind that if you should be confronted with a situation where your life will be taken, unless you succumb to those other influences, it's as if God vows as if you actually were murdered and you gave your life to sanctify his name. So Rabbeinu Osher, in his work Orchos Chaim, he cites this. But not only here, so the Rosh Rabbeinu Osher is a Rishon. It's an early commentary. But there's a Sifri, which is written by an Amora. It's like the Talmud. He cites the Sifri, it says, B'chol nafshcho. So the Talmud tells us, even B'chol nafshcho, you must love God with all your life, even if your life is going to be taken. You're given an ultimatum. So the Sifri cites the verse of Tehillim. As it says, Olechta horagnu kol hayom. For you, we are murdered every day. So he quotes Reb Shimon Menashe. This is already the Tanoic period. Tanoim say this. So he asks the question: is it possible for a person to die every day? How could David say one person could die multiple times in a lifetime? You only have one life. Once you die, you're no longer alive. So he explains, God values this thought regarding tzaddikim as if they give their lives every day for God. Now, what's interesting is Rabbeinu Bachya, who's a student of Nachmanides. He writes, and he has a question. God is in the future. So God knows the choice of every person. And as I always say, people make a big mistake. They ask a question, if God knows what choice you're going to make, so one doesn't have free choice. You have choice, but you have no choice because it's destined you should do whatever you're meant to do. So initially you have no choice. So how can we say man has free choice? So we've explained it multiple times. Then we say God knows the future. God knows the choice you will make. Although you haven't made it yet, but he knows exactly what choice you're going to make. As a result of that, we have free choice. I always give the example because it's an important point. Most 90% of people, or 95%, have this difficulty. If you know a person is a kleptomaniac, we haven't heard the word recently, because stealing is not a crime today. You can break into stores, burn down the store, take out the Rolex watches, and you can have it on film, no prosecution. But let's say you have a kleptomaniac, goes into a store, you could put money on it, there's no question. This person's walking out with some of the merchandise from that store. And you know it, without a question. Did that person have choice? I mean, maybe not because he has this illness. He's a kleptomaniac. Because he has no control over his behavior. So maybe that person doesn't have choice. But let's say you have another person who's totally dishonest. And he has no compunction about stealing. And you leave $100 bill on your table, and the person comes in to do a repair in your house. And the man has no scruples about stealing. Guaranteed, that man's going to take the $100 bill. He may not go through your drawers, but if it's sitting on your counter, he's somehow going to put it in his pocket. That $100 bill. And you'll have it on camera. Did that man have choice? Of course he had choice. Not speaking the person has no control over his behavior. Because he has no scruples, he chose to steal. So although you know he's going to steal, you're knowing, does that in any way infringe on his free choice? You create a scenario to give him the choice. So, but because he has no scruples, he stole. Hashem knows exactly, he knows the future. So he already knows in advance what choice you're going to make. So he knows your choice. But man has choice. So Rabbeinu Bachya asks a very interesting question. God cannot punish a person unless he crosses the line, unless he transgresses. So a person who ultimately is going to transgress, that person makes sense he should live. Because why did God put man in the physical existence? For challenges. Okay? That's why. So to punish a person, unless you fail the challenge, he can't punish you. You can't punish a person unless he's transgressed. But the tzaddik, who will always succeed, why put the tzaddik through this kind of lifetime? Why should you? Seemingly, it's not fair. It doesn't make sense. If you want to know, to see, is he going to meet the challenge or not? God knows he's going to meet the challenge. So if God knows he's going to meet the challenge, why put him through all this suffering and the difficulties of life? Just give him his reward in the world to come without him coming into physical existence. That's a question which is asked by Rabbeinu Bachya, who's the student of Nachmanides. So he answers something very interesting. He answers that if that would be the case, there'd be no role models of tzaddikim who walk the face of the earth. The only reason why people have choice is because they have alternatives. You have a representative of evil, you have a representative of good. So if you're in the middle of the road, now you have to make a decision. It's not clear which direction you should go. So the tzaddik, he represents the positive role model. The other person represents the negative role model. Which one should I be attracted to? So the only reason why there's free choice for the average person is only because you have a representation of good, which is the tzaddik who represents that good. But if the tzaddik will be pre-rewarded and not live in this life, what chance does anyone have? There's no positive influence or representation of good in the world. Therefore, the tzaddik does not live for himself. When God puts the tzaddik in this world, it's not for himself. He's here in this world for others. He's living his life to be the role model for others. So why is he going through all this difficulty of life? The challenges and the suffering. Why? He's going through for others. It comes out very interesting. So the tzaddik has to give his life or live a life of misery or serious challenges. Is that for himself? It's not for himself. So he gets additional credit. He gets additional credit because not only is he living, he's not for himself, he's living for others. So let's say now there's a question, should he give his life to sanctify God's name? Of course he gives his life. Because he's never living his life for himself. The tzaddik is agreeable to be in this world to live for others. If that's God's glory, I'm agreeable to live for that reason. Because in terms of his own level of accomplishment, God knows he would succeed. But knowing he succeeds is not going to help others. Because you need his representation. He has to be there as the role model. So now, you say the Shema. So the Sifri says, Reb Shimon Nasi says, who's from the Tanakh Peri says, Tzadikim, the devoutly righteous who give their lives, who visualize in their minds, if they're ever confronted with giving their lives, they will give their lives. God vows as if they gave their lives. So when David says in Tehillim, for you we are murdered every day, we're speaking of the devoutly righteous, that they live their life for the sake of God. So therefore, as a result of this, when they have that in mind, there's no question they will give their lives. Because their whole life, they do not live for themselves. They only live for God's sake, not for their own sake, for that reason. This is the Sifri, which is the equivalent of the Talmud itself. There's a midrash which is cited where the Amora, this is from the Amorite period. Omer Shalom ben Riyumi, ein l'chol kol tzad v'tzadik. Al shemoshim atzman b'chol yom. Every tzaddik, he gives his life every day for God. So he says, Kilu nergu al kiddush Hashem. God values it as if they were killed to sanctify God's name. So it concludes the Midrash. Rav Nachman says, based on this verse, that a person who always has this in mind, that he's always willing to give his life, and he depicts it in his mind, Nochel arba beos olamos lolam abo. He will inherit in the world to come 400 worlds, whatever that means, spiritual worlds. That's how valuable this is. That a Jew who always has in mind that he's willing to die for God, if he should be confronted with that situation, God says you're worthy to inherit 400 worlds in the spiritual world. This is the Midrash. Now, the Mishnah Berurah, which is the Chavetz Chaim, when he cites the Mechaber, the Shulchan Aruch, about the obligation of Shema and what mindset you have to have when we say the Shema. If you have the Code of Laws, it's 61, first law. It's translated. You can download it. The number in Hebrew is Samach Aleph, 61A. The Shulchan Aruch writes, Yikra Kriya Shema b'kavona. When you say the Shema, you have to say it with intent. Be'ema u'biyira. With fear and with reverence. The rest is u'b'zeya. With trembling. The level of reverence and all has to be that literally you tremble as if when you declare your belief in God. You know, lahavdil, person, I'm not sure what they do today in public schools, but at one time in public schools, and even when I was in elementary school in the 50s, we used to pledge allegiance to the flag, even in the yeshiva. Religious children, part of the education was you were a patriot. We used to have assemblies and we used to sing the Star Spangled Banner, and we had all that, and with a musical accompaniment. They taught the children they have to be appreciative, be patriotic to the country. That's what it was. But a person who's a true patriot, when he sings the Star Spangled Banner, he closes his eyes and he puts his hand on his heart. And also you see people shedding tears. They're like consumed with this feeling of patriotism. If you understand what it means to accept God's dominion, the God is the creator. He wills every moment of your existence. And you go and you declare your belief in him, and you articulate the words, who he is and who you are. You say it with reverence and with trepidation, with trembling. And that's the way it should be said. Otherwise, it says, it's half-baked. I once told over a story many years ago. This person was not an observant Jew. He belonged to Rabbi Schneier Shul on the Upper East Side. And there was a person many years ago who came to Yad Avram, and he was a friend of his, because this person was in the real estate business. And this other person was a real estate broker. So he knew him, and they had a relationship. And this person tells me he wants to bring a friend to see me. I said, you're welcome to bring him. He wants to speak to you about something very important. Very important. I said, fine. And on 63rd Street, I had a very small office. My office was a small office. The base medrash where we had the classes and the lectures was beautiful, large space, but my office was very small. So he comes with this person who was a student of mine, who was a friend of this real estate person. He himself was about 6'4". This person he brings in must be about 6'6", even taller than he is. And he brings him in. The two of them barely could fit in the office with me in there, with the furniture. So afterwards, he says, I think he says, it's something very personal. He would like to speak to you by himself privately. I said, fine, sit down. Sits down. He crosses his legs. I mean, nearly breaks my desk because there's not enough room for him to extend his legs. And all of a sudden, he starts crying. And I say, is everything okay? He says, it's not so simple. He says, a year ago, I had a heart transplant. Today is the anniversary of the year of the transplant. And my body is rejecting the heart. And they say I will need another transplant. And I'm not sure if I'll be able to have another heart, and I may die. And not only that, I'm in my fourth marriage or fifth marriage, and I have one child, and he's going to be bar mitzvah in 3 months at Rabbi Schneier Shul. I'm not sure if I'm going to make it to the bar mitzvah. And he's crying. So I said to him, as you've had the first heart, with God's help, God will provide a second heart. Be optimistic. Okay? So I said, I want to ask you a question. That you had the first heart transplant, and if not for that, you would have died. In what way did you express your thanks to God that He allowed you to locate a heart and you were a recipient of that heart? What did you do? Did you study more? He says, I grew up in White Plains. It left a bad taste in my mouth. Therefore, I don't study. I said, so what did you do for God? He gave you a year of additional life. It's worth a lot. You had your son, you have your wife, you were able to make money, you're able to live. Well, how did you show your appreciation to God? He says, well, I gave a few $100s to charity. This man was worth tens of millions of dollars. And when I hear he says he gave a few $100s to charity, I said, you know what you remind me of? Somebody gives someone $1 million cashier's check for immediate deposit without a question. And he takes the check, walks out of the room. So somebody says, by the way, did you say thank you? He says, something, to go back 50 feet to say thank you, it's too much. I'm going on my way. I said, you remind me of that person. I wish you luck. Have a good day. And that was the end of the story. He did not make it to his son's bar mitzvah. You got it? The man has tens of millions of dollars. God gives you a year of life. And we're talking about a person who believes to a degree in God, that God had something to do with it. How do you not become more observant? Accept something. Torah doesn't leave a good taste in your mouth, so you don't open a book. You're not observant to any degree. At least be an ethical, moral human being to support, give charity, to say thank you. As they used to say, the lights are on, nobody's home. That's the way it is. When you say Shema and you connect with those words, nothing less than reverence and trepidation. You have to say it that way. If you don't, the answer is you don't get it. Even if he's focused, why should I tremble? Because if you understand how integral God is to your existence, that every aspect of your function only is the way it is because He wills it to be that. So first, how are you not focused? And even if you are focused, how don't you say it with reverence and fear and trepidation? The answer is you're not there. That's the answer. But to even attempt to do it. So over here, the Mishnah Berurah, in his commentary, writes, what does it mean by kavana? You have to say it with intent. Listen to this. He cites the Jerusalem Talmud that the 3 paragraphs of the Shema contain within them on illusionary level the 10 commandments, the Seres HaDibros. The first paragraph, second paragraph, and the third. But he goes to show how when you say Hashem Elokeinu, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, the first of the 10 commandments is Anochi Hashem Elokecho. That's Hashem Echad. Right? Hashem Elokeinu, Anochi Hashem Elokecho. I am your God who took you out of Egypt. That's the first commandment. We conclude the first verse, Hashem Echad. God is one. Nothing exists outside of God. That's the second of the 10 commandments. Lo yicha Elohim acherim aponai. There are no other powers outside of me. That's echot. So just in the first verse, we're alluding to the first two commandments of the Ten Commandments. V'ahavta. You must love God. Just the word love. Lo siso. You're not permitted to say God's name in vain. What does it mean you can't say? Why not? Because if you understand, if you have a relation with God, you don't say that name in vain. Could you imagine? Lavdil. There's a story that Rabbi Akiva, he would always spar with the governor of Yerushalayim, Roman governor, eventually put him to death. And Rabbi Akiva, he says to Rabbi Akiva, I want you to tell me what you're gonna dream tomorrow. He says, no problem. He says, I had a dream that there were two dogs. One's name was Rufus, which was his name, and the other dog's name was Rufina. That was his wife's name. So when he tells him about the dream that he dreamt that the dogs were called Rufus and Rufina, he became infuriated. Where do you have this audacity? Our names are our dogs. He says, what's the problem? You say that the statue, the idol, although it's made of plaster or stone, and you take the deity and you name the piece of stone after the whatever it is, after what you believe in. So what are you getting so upset about? That's what Rabbi Akiva says to him. But why was it? How do you take the name of our names that were prestigious representations of the Roman power and put it on a dog? How do you enunciate that name unless it has special value to say that name? How do you say that name in vain? That's specially, because that automatically tells you that you don't value what that name is, what that name represents. The President of the United States, when you refer to him, you don't refer to him by his name. President Trump, when you speak directly to him, or the governor, the honorable governor, you don't even say his name because it's not respectful. Because of his position of office, it's not respectful to refer to him by his name. So God is the creator. God who wills every moment of existence. How do you say his name in vain? We say Hashem. We say the name. We don't say his name itself. It's alluding that there is that special name. So when you say V'ahavta, you must love, just the word, you must love, if you had that true love for him, you don't say his name in vain. So that word alludes to the third of the commandments. You should not say God's name in vain. There's a verse in Mishlei, in Proverbs, where King Solomon says, how do you deal with a deprecator? A deprecator. Let's talk it. A deprecator, you can't reason with him logically or explain. The person doesn't have the capacity or the interest in really understanding it, because he always sees it in the most mocking, deprecating context. So Shlomo says, King Solomon says, how do you deal with a deprecator? You smite him, because that's the only thing you do. The intellectual approach doesn't work. A person who's off track, doesn't understand, he could be wizened. A deprecator cannot be wizened. So who is this referring to? Amalek, who attacked us after the splitting of the sea, where the whole world stood in awe and trembled of the Jewish people. This nomad band attacked us. If the whole world trembles, why did the Amalekites tremble? You know why? Because regardless of what you show them, it doesn't resonate in them, doesn't touch them. So how do you deal with them? If that doesn't touch them, you think getting involved in a philosophical, intellectual argument, they're gonna be able to embrace it? The only way to deal with them is smite them. And that's why the Torah says you must obliterate them. you must destroy them because they have no value. They will never, at any moment, have a capacity to accept God. And if you can't accept God, God says they have to be removed from existence. That's a deprecator. So I always say, what's a deprecator? Why does a person deprecate something? Because he can't appreciate the value of whatever that person represents. I gave you the example. You have a comedian, right? A comedian can make a mockery out of anyone. And let's say talk about Bob Hope, world-renowned comedian. And you have, let's say Ronald Reagan was the president, which many people felt he was like the last statesman, or had relevance to being a statesman, maybe. Okay? And the comedian goes and makes a mockery out of Reagan as the president of the United States. First of all, the office itself. In those days, people did not make a mockery of the president because in terms of what he represented, his power, his importance, whatever way you would define it. So if a person goes and has the ability to make a mockery of him and have the crowd laughing about him, why is that person able to reduce that president to a mockery, to be a laughing stock? That literally they can't get off the floor from laughing. That's how they're laughing about him. Because that comedian doesn't have the true capacity to appreciate the representation of what he represents, that person. That's the only reason why he could make a mockery to that degree. Because if you truly, and I'll give you an example. So maybe, I don't like getting involved in politics. Whether it's Reagan, his economic philosophy, whatever. Person has a father, and he loves his father, and he reveres his father, and he esteems his father, and he himself is a comedian. Would he ever go and mimic and make a mockery of his father, use him as part of his routine to make a mockery of his father? But the answer is definitely not. But you have such an ability. He would never consider it because he sees it as such a level of disrespect. Because you don't make a mockery of your father if you truly revere and love your father. You don't do such a thing. And if you could, that means there's something very seriously wrong in that relation between that son and that father. That's the reason. Many years ago, there was a certain person who was related to my Rosh Hashiva, Zecher Tzarek Lebrocha. And he was a rabbi in a certain modern Orthodox synagogue. And he had spoken about his experiences growing up and whatever it may be. And my Rishiva had very bad eyesight. And he told over a story that he was once wearing a striped shirt, and this person was his grandfather. My Rishiva was his grandfather. And he says, my grandfather was as blind as a bat, and he couldn't see the stripes on my shirt. And you could hear, and I listened to the thing, and you could hear the crowd laughing. Could you imagine? My Rishiva was a leading Torah sage of the generation. Wasn't an ordinary person. And this is his grandfather. And he goes and he uses his grandfather as a basis and gets the crowd to laugh. So somebody sent me the tape. I'll tell you, sent me the tape. Effie Bookwald sent me the tape. He wanted me to, because he felt it was totally inappropriate, the tape. But many other things he said on tape. And I listened to it, and I was really upset. I was very close. I was like a grandson to my Rosh Hashiva. And I called him up. And he says, I hear that you're angry. This guy had, he took on the offense, no defense. I hear you're angry. That's what he says to me. This phone call goes back 35 years ago. He says, I hear you're angry. I said, I'm not angry. I'm disappointed. Very disappointed. He says, why are you disappointed? And I took that piece that he had spoken about, him being as blind as a bat and couldn't see the straps on the shirt. I said, let me ask you, is that appropriate? Is that the way you speak about your grandfather and you have the crowd laughing? He says, I must admit that was wrong. You understand? He says that but how do you even consider saying it? It was wrong. He shouldn't have. But to be even consider it, you don't say such things. The answer is because it wasn't so simple. It was vividly clear, and he understood who was grammar. He couldn't make that remark. Impossible. A person can only say God's name in vain if you don't love God. When you say Vahavta, and to what degree you have to love God, to give you life, give away everything. Do you say his name in vain? If that's the way you're supposed to love God, you don't. Many years ago, I went to, wasn't the most recent visit. About 15 years ago, I went to Buenos Aires. It was the summer, there was the winter. And so why did I go to Buenos Aires? Because many years ago, I had one of my close students became a Baltruba at Yad Avram, and he himself became he was a young man, and maybe then he was in his 40s. He became one of the wealthiest Jews in Buenos Aires. And he wanted the people to meet me. I should speak there to see what exactly we have in New York. And he wanted to replicate it in Buenos Aires. So I must have spoken when I was there, that visit, maybe 10 times to different groups, college students, businessmen, various things. So he himself was observant. Originally, was not observant at all. He really had a reform background. So there was a school that was a secular school. In South America, they have schools that are called cultural schools. They teach cultural Judaism, nothing to do with God whatsoever. And some of this school, it was a private school, very wealthy people sent their children there. And the school was in bankruptcy, and he bought it from the bank out of bankruptcy. And being an observant Jew, he felt that since he has the purse strings, he will have some kind of influence that they should consider the Orthodox tradition, giving it a background. So he wanted I should visit the school. And the school prided themselves because they taught secular subjects in English. In Buenos Aires in those days, the average person did not speak English. If you spoke English, either you were very well educated college-wise, or you're from another class. Like in Poland, the wealthy class spoke French in Poland. So here, the wealthy class, they see themselves as intellectuals. Their children are educated in speaking English. And this was this school. So I go with this person. His name was Eduardo Elstein. And somebody else who was a rabbi of a Turkish synagogue, which had about 1,000 members. And the three of us go. So the headmaster of the school, you realize this guy, Eduardo Elstein, he's wearing a yarmulke on his head. I look like an Orthodox rabbi, and this other rabbi is a rabbi of the local community, very large synagogue. The man doesn't have respect to put something on his head. He talks to us, nothing on his head, okay? He doesn't get it. But you realize this man, if he wants to pull the plug on the school, he could shut the school down immediately. And you people are out on the street, doesn't get it, okay? So what were they? That day they had a skit or a graduation. Children were graduating from preschool or from kindergarten to preschool, okay? And all the grandparents came. And you could see from the grandparents and the parents how they dressed. They're very wealthy people. And they're shepping nachas, as we say. Their grandchildren, children graduating from kindergarten to preschool. And the teacher made a skit that they singing Shechianu, because they also spoke Hebrew. And they say the bracha, Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam, and they put it to a tune. They say God's name, Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam, by saying God's name, Shechianu v'kimon v'gion lo bazmana, and they're singing with music, dancing, repeating God's name over multiple times. Could you understand? Just keep saying it over and over again. Not Shechianu v'kimon v'gion lo bazmana, the full blessing with the name of Hashem. When I heard this, I cringed. I mean, how do you go say God's name in vain, multiple times? And they're saying with a joy. The answer is they don't know any better. They don't know any better. But it was like, it pained me to see it. If you understand what that name represents, how do you just say it? To turn it into a skit that you're putting on to celebrate the graduation. So they asked me to speak. Could you imagine? Of course, Eduardo else who wanted I should speak said, parents look at me, black suit or dark suit, black hat. They say, where did this guy come from? You know, some archaic Jew. You know, we've been running away from this all our lives. And now this guy's here. Okay. They didn't realize I could speak English better than all them with the headmaster combined. So I began speaking. And the book that they had given the children graduating from kindergarten into preschool was a Tanakh. That's the book they were giving them. Tanakh. So I begin speaking. I say, you know something? It's very interesting. We as Jews were known to the world as the people of the book. People of the book. Which book? The book of physics that was written by Einstein to elucidate his theory of relativity? Was it medicine by Sabin? Which book are we talking about? I said, you know which book we're talking about? The book which is rooted in the divine, the Tanakh, the book that you're giving these little children graduating from kindergarten into preschool. That's the book. So as much as you don't recognize the innate value of your Judaism, but literally on a subconscious level, the book we speak about is only that's the book, because our lives are synonymous with that book. That's what I said. Did it register, resonate? Not. Nothing. You understand? V'havto. When you say the word v'havto, what does it allude to? Lo sisa Shem Hashem Elokecha lo Hashem. Don't say the name of God in vain. Because if you truly understand what that represents, it's like the father, the son being this comedian professional, and he loves his father. There's no way his father's going to be the object of his humor. Impossible. Because it'd be in contradiction to everything that he feels about his father.